Good evening. Good? Okay, how's the volume? Is it too loud? We're experimenting here, so, okay. I'm Angela Bettler. I'm an administrative assistant in the president's office at South Dakota Mines. So welcome to Steam Cafe tonight. Steam Cafe is a partnership with Hay Camp Brewing and South Dakota Public Broadcasting. So we thank them for their support, and we thank you for your support as well. This is being broadcast on Zoom, so for those of you who are attending on Zoom, and for those of you in the audience, after the presentation, we'll do a Q&A with our presenter, so feel free to ask questions. Those of you who are on Zoom, if you type your question into the chat box or the Q&A box, we will answer it. We will have it answered live. I will read it to the presenter, and she will answer it live. Yeah, so that's all I've got. So with no further ado, Dr. Christy Tidwell.
Didn't do that when I tested earlier. Good? Was that you? Okay. Hi, yeah, I'm Dr. Christy Tidwell. I'm professor of English and Humanities at School of Mines. And I wanted to start by just saying a little bit about what I work on, because that's largely what you're getting today, is kind of a crash course in the sort of research that I do. So I mostly focus on environmental issues in horror and science fiction, thinking about speculative fiction. Do I have to stand right in front of the screen for this not to make noise? Okay. Okay. And so today I'm talking about environmental science fiction and eco-horror and the ways that they kind of address political and social issues for us. I've written about this plenty of times. Where's the computer?
You might need to just mouse on it there. There we go.
Are we working now? Okay. So this is part of my self-introduction. These are two books that I have co-edited on these topics. And my purpose today is really to give you a kind of crash course in environmental science fiction and horror and the ways that they address our fears related to nature, and also to introduce some of the ideas from scholarship on the topic. So when we're back up here, what I wanted to start with is a couple of definitions of horror and science fiction, just in case these are unfamiliar genres, and to give you a sense of how I am using the terms. Oh my God. Okay. So science fiction and horror are both speculative fiction, right? So they're both building from the world that we have now, but not in the world we have now exactly. Science fiction extrapolates from the world as we know it now, so we can kind of get there from here. It's based on what we already know and taking a few steps from there. There is usually a connection to reality. Horror does not require that. Horror instead is primarily about fear. So what are we afraid of? And it really doesn't matter what the fear is. For today, we're looking at fears regarding nature, but it could be anything else. It doesn't require any rational explanation. In many of the movies I'm looking at today, horror and science fiction can get kind of blurry. They may coexist. So Alien is a great example of this, where you have a space exploration story, kind of exploring what's possible in the universe, but then we tell a monster story in the middle of that. So we have science fiction and horror working together. And to guide my talk today, I'm going to build on this definition of eco-horror from scholarship on the topic. Usually when people think of eco-horror, they think of animals attacking. They think of, nature's revenge, and that's definitely part of it. I'm going to spend some time talking about that. But in addition to that, we have this definition that includes also texts in which humans do horrific things to the natural world, or in which horrific texts and tropes are used to promote ecological awareness, represent ecological crises, or blur human, non-human distinctions more broadly. So my talk works in three parts, kind of following this structure, where we have first films that are about our fear of nature, nature as monstrous. We have second, films that address the ways that we fear for nature, and our kind of impacts on the natural world. And we have third, films that blur those human, non-human lines. So to begin, fear of nature appears in many guises. I'm going to give just a few examples of this. One is through plant horror. These are two of my kind of favorite plant horror movies, Day of the Triffids and the Ruins. And in plant horror, we have monsters that we wouldn't normally think of as monstrous, right? We're not usually scared of plants. They kind of just sit there and they don't do much, right? Don Keatley, a scholar in this field, writes about plant horror as reflecting fears of plants as something that lurk in our blind spots. We don't notice that they're there. They menace with their wild, purposeless growth, and they represent an absolute rupture of the known. So in other words, plants are scary largely because we don't fully understand them and we cannot control them. We also see movies about fears of fungus, which is similar to plants, but a little different. Two recent movies, Gaia and In the Earth, from 2021, coincidentally, like the same year was a big year for fungus horror, reflect something interesting here, I think, about similar ideas that come up with plant horror, but also the sense in which fungus can influence human action. So we think we're kind of separate from the natural world in this way, but if a fungus gets in you, it can actually kind of make you do different things. That's the premise in the movies. So in the movies, we also have these images of human bodies covered with fungal growth. They're supposed to be really kind of scary and disgusting, and spores that disorient. There's these really trippy scenes in the earth that illustrate that kind of loss of our sense of reality. More significantly, we see fears regarding weather and climate. And this is where I think we're maybe more familiar with this kind of thing. So we see climate change coming up a lot in the 21st century. And I kind of lump together weather and climate because the movies aren't always separating them, right? So in 2004, we have Roland Emmerich's film, The Day After Tomorrow, which I find to be a fascinating example of this because Emmerich, who also directed Independence Day and all these big blockbuster action movies, really actually wanted this to say something about climate change and to get this into the kind of popular conversation. If you've seen the movie, you may already have a sense of where that goes. It is a somewhat ridiculous movie, right? It's an action thriller, it's fast-paced. There's a scene where I think Jake Gyllenhaal and some of the other characters are literally running from ice as it's freezing behind them. So, I mean, it's not very realistic. It takes something that's large scale over a long time frame and really speeds it up in order to make it fit the genre, and winds up getting the conversation going about climate change in a different way than it had been. People talked about this movie, but it was largely more like, man, that's ridiculous, instead of, oh wow, we should maybe take climate change seriously. Sharknado is another kind of example of movies that pick up on climate change concerns in the 21st century, doing it in even more ridiculous ways. When I was looking earlier, there's either 5 or 8 Sharknado movies, depending on which ones you count, and they are all kind of built on this anxiety about changing weather patterns and more dramatic and more exotic sorts of weather events like a Sharknado. But they're, again, not something that prompts us to really take these issues seriously. Crawl is another one that I think is really interesting because on the face of it, it is an alligator attack movie. It's about a father and daughter who are trapped in their basement and fighting off alligators, but it's also, again, a climate change movie. It's a massive hurricane that is directly mentioned in the film as the result of climate change and more hurricanes set in Florida and larger hurricanes. And the director, Alexandre Aja, also talks a lot about wanting this to say something about climate change. So there are these moves to try to use this fear of nature, of something bigger than us that can kill us or destroy our lives, to say something real. How effective it is a different question. And then one other kind of big picture thing to begin with in this section is thinking about different spaces. So the rural is not something that I would necessarily consider nature in the same way as like weather or climate or plants, but it's set up as nature in a lot of films like Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Cabin in the Woods as someplace that is in direct opposition to the city and the urban and the developed. And in these films, we get, basically, if you've not seen any of these, the premise, it goes through tons of movies. You'd be surprised how many horror movies start with just, here's these city people getting in a car and driving out to the country, right? And then bad things happen because they're in the country, right? But it's tied to that sense of kind of otherness of being out there away from development. Carol Clover writes about this as urbanoia, and she describes the way that these films develop this idea about the kind of tension between city and country. She writes, "It is not just that the city men have more money than the country people, it is that their city comforts are costing country people their ancestral home. The real motor of the city revenge or urbanoia film, I suggest, is economic guilt." So if we look at something like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the place that they go is economically depressed, right? The meatpacking industry is dying down and they turn to other sources of meat. So that's clear in there. Or if you look at a movie like Deliverance, which I didn't include up there, we see something really similar where you have these city people going out into the country to enjoy this place that is being destroyed by their kind of city practices. The ways in which cities depend on outside spaces to have these natural spaces or to grow food or to do meatpacking or to do whatever it is. These films, Clover continues, emphasize urban crimes against the country. Dammed rivers, stripped forests, dirt-biked and snowmobiled wilderness, mercury-filled lakes, irradiated rangeland, and by extension against those who have been economically dispossessed in the process. So far, the main theme here is we see the natural world in all these different forms as exceeding our control, as dangerous. Sometimes these threats are inherent to nature, they just are dangerous, and sometimes they're the result of our actions. There are even more examples of our fear of the natural world when we start looking at films about animals. Animal horror is its own subgenre that is huge. It goes in kind of waves, where like the 1970s, for instance, we saw tons of animal horror. We see a lot in the early 21st century. And it includes stories about real animals sometimes, as well as more fantastic creatures. I'm starting with The Birds and Birdemic here, because The Birds is a classic, right? Hitchcock, 1963. And it illustrates some of the key elements of this sort of fear of the natural world, where we have creatures that, kind of like with the plants, as I was talking about earlier, we don't notice all the time, we don't think of them as a threat, and then suddenly they're attacking, like attacking a children's birthday party, attacking Tippi Hedren, right? It's really scary, and there's no explanation. We don't know why they're attacking, and the movie is not interested in telling us why. It's interested in creating this sense of fear surrounding the birds. Birdemic is not a good movie. I don't recommend it, just to be clear. I paired it with The Birds. They're very different quality. But it takes some of these same kind of ideas and updates it. And in the 21st century, we also have a more explicit environmental argument kind of built in, even in a really dumb movie, where at some point the main characters are walking along and there's already been bird attacks, and they meet an environmentalist just kind of hanging out in the woods who proceeds to give them a lecture, right? So the movie is really determined to make sure you're thinking about this in environmental terms. I think birds are an interesting choice because, as I said, they're normally not something we're scared of. We think of them as benign, right? Especially the smaller birds that we see in The Birds. They're non-threatening, and also because we're really more of a threat to them than they are to us. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring was published the same time frame as The Birds came out, I think the year before. And it's centered around this, like the loss of the birds, the loss of birdsong as the result of our actions, the use of pesticides and DDT specifically. I can't talk about animal horror without talking about sharks, right? So Jaws is the classic here in 1975. It was hugely influential in multiple ways. So briefly, it changed the movie industry, right? It's often credited as being one of the first summer blockbuster films that affects the way that we do summer blockbusters now. It led to all these movies and many more that I couldn't fit onto the screen. And it's arguably also had an impact on the way sharks are treated in the real world. It's a little hard to track this like a direct causal relationship, that Jaws did all of the things that happened later, but there is at least a correlation between the release of Jaws and people's responses to sharks worldwide. Peter Benchley, who wrote the novel that the movie is based on, has actually talked about regretting writing the book since then because of these kinds of impacts. And I want to point out that the sharks here, I think we get something interesting when we look at this with birds. They both, in these instances, are looking at real animals and representing them in some cases somewhat realistically, right? Even if we don't get an explanation for their behaviors, as we also don't with Jaws, they are not fantastic creatures. They're unusual, right? And that's something mentioned in Jaws, that this shark is not behaving like normal sharks do. But it's really just kind of a slightly amped up version of a shark, right? Some of the other films that we see here for sharks, are also playing into this sense of realism. Open water is a good example of that, where you don't get a lot of like, oh no, monster shark, it's just sharks. And you're in the water with the sharks, and maybe that's not where you want to be, right? Others are obviously much more dramatic than that. Deep Blue is an example of one where it's really not about sharks so much as it is about what we've done to them. They're like modified sharks. And Santa jaws and sand sharks are two excellent examples of ridiculousness. And I haven't actually watched those. I love the premise and the covers for them. But they're clearly not invested in like representing sharks as sharks, right? They want to draw on these kinds of fears that we already have to do something fun. And one more slide here for monstrous animals, because I think these examples are animals that are more clearly threatening to humans, like sharks can be. I don't really want to be in the water with a great white shark, but lots of people actually do swim with sharks, and they're not that deadly to us. But bears are maybe a more reasonable worry, right? We both live on land, for instance. We're more likely to meet them. Piranha's a little different. I can avoid them. Anacondas, I think there's a lot of fear of snakes for me and others that this plays into, and anacondas are large and potentially threatening. But even in this case, we see that they're kind of amping up the fear of it, right? The fear of nature, it's not enough just to be like, well, grizzly bears can be dangerous, right? It's also 18 feet of towering fury, right? And the most dangerous jaws in the land, which is very much a play on Jaws. This comes out a few years later. And piranha, we see also, just to note, the same kind of poster design as we have with Jaws. And I did want to comment on Cocaine Bear, which is the most recent one here. It departs a little bit from what the other ones are doing because it's a comedy as well. But it's also really interesting as we think about the relationship between reality and these things, because Cocaine Bear is inspired by true events, right? Very loosely. So if you're not familiar, like Cocaine Bear, the premise of the movie is that, you know, this bear finds some cocaine in the woods. It fell out of a plane, and it ingests it, and then it goes on a rampage. Right? In reality, a bear found some cocaine in the woods. It ingested it, and it died, like pretty immediately. They found a dead bear in the woods and discovered that it had a lot of cocaine in its stomach. And so the real story is actually not funny at all, right? It's a story about, you know, this unlucky bear and the ways that our kind of stuff gets in its way. At the core of animal attack movies is the act of animals eating or attempting to eat humans. Val Plumwood writes in Surviving a Crocodile Attack, this essay from the early 21st century about her surviving a crocodile attack. She literally was out in the Australian bush, was attacked by a crocodile, made her way back to civilization, and she writes about what happens after that point, which is, one, people wanted to go kill the crocodile, but she objected to this on the grounds that it was just like living its crocodile life, and also how are you going to get the right crocodile, right? And there was also a lot of talk about what she was even doing out there to begin with, and a lot of anxiety about her as a woman out in the bush, and a lot of the responses she saw tended to be really tied up in this fear and anxiety about becoming prey. So this essay is a really fascinating look at this, and she argues that there is a strong effort to deny that we humans are also animals positioned in the food chain. Horror movies and stories also reflect this deep-seated dread of becoming food for other forms of life. Horror is the wormy corpse, vampires sucking blood, and alien monsters eating humans. Horror and outrage usually greet stories of other species eating humans. So that's what we've been seeing so far. She continues, the idea of human prey threatens the dualistic vision of human mastery in which we humans manipulate nature from outside as predators but never prey. We may daily consume other animals by the billions, but we ourselves cannot be food for worms and certainly not meat for crocodiles. And so she's describing this sense of a category violation, that we're not supposed to be like this. We are separate, we are better than that, we're different. And argues that we should be considering ourselves as part of this system. Not necessarily that you like want to get eaten by an animal, like it's okay to object to that as an experience, but that we don't need to think of ourselves as completely separate from this whole system. And so the message that we get, contrary to what Plumwood is arguing from a lot of these movies, is that we are separate and that non-human animals are monsters and we should fear them. And if fear is our primary response to them, it becomes harder to imagine why we should protect them. One idea that is relevant here is ecophobia. This is one of the more recent ideas in the scholarship in this area. Simon Estock writes about this and describes ecophobia as an irrational and groundless hatred of the natural world, as present and subtle in our daily lives and literature as homophobia and racism and sexism. He goes further than that in some pieces, arguing that ecophobic representations are harmful in the same ways that homophobia, sexism, and racism are, and this should be considered hate speech. I think this is an intriguing idea. It's a useful term. I think he goes farther than I would with this. It's a very dramatic statement. And part of my issue with it is that this ignores the fact that some fear is rational, right? Some of what we've seen in the movies is played up. It's maybe not at a rational level. But sometimes fear is rational, sometimes it is justified, and sometimes it can lead to change. So the question for me, leading into the second section of this talk, is what are we afraid of? Monstrous animals in these representations might do more harm than good, like with Jaws, but other kinds of fear might be more productive. So, part 2 here, thinking about fear for nature. So if there are productive ways of using fear, this is where I see some possibilities for that. And this is in practice often combined with fear of nature. It's hard to separate the two in the movies, but this idea, and the movies that address this, introduce a sense of concern for the natural world, a recognition that it can be harmed and that it is being harmed by us, and that maybe we have some responsibility. So I'm going to start by talking about Jurassic Park and Jurassic World, and stick with me for a second because this actually is relevant to that, although it doesn't seem like it at first. These aren't necessarily the movies that you think of when you think of our concern for nature, partly because it's about dinosaur monsters, right? So there's a sense in which this is also about fear of nature, but this is nature that we have created and we have inserted back into the world. So with Jurassic Park movies, that is a central focus. Like, we were able to bring these creatures back, what happens then, right? Jurassic World extends this, but also adds in some more environmental issues as we work through the trilogy. So thinking about the theme park that is actually functioning in Jurassic World. The second movie in that series, Fallen Kingdom, also brings up ideas of animal protection, as there are questions of what do we do with these animals now that we've brought them back? What responsibility do we have for them? And the final movie, so far, is Jurassic World Dominion, and it, as the title implies, is about who's in charge, right? Who does this planet belong to? And is there room for both of us to coexist? I've also got up here, I want to mention really briefly Carnosaur, another 1993 dinosaur movie that does not get a lot of love. It is weird, and its premise, just so that you know about it, is that there's a female scientist who is trying to impregnate women with dinosaur babies, but then they will die when they're birthing the dinosaur babies so that the dinosaurs can take over the world. So it's got some themes in common with the other two, but it goes in a different direction. And so one reason I see these as connected to this idea of fear for nature is that they are so concerned with extinction. And one way of looking at these is to see that what they have to say about extinction is that as we're living through the 6th great extinction and we're seeing other species going extinct all around the world at this really high rate, much higher than the background rate, these movies seem to tell a story where maybe extinction is not permanent, right? Maybe we can bring animals back. In this case, we weren't responsible for their extinction, but in others, more recently, we have been. What if we could bring back the thylacine, right? What does that do for the way we think about extinction as it is ongoing? And it raises the question of, why we should fear extinction or feel guilty about it if we can do that. In fact, the movies seem to say it's not extinction we should worry about, but de-extinction and the loss of our special place in the food chain. And the ending of Jurassic Park on the top and Jurassic World on the bottom, I think, underscore this with these visuals of the triumphant T-Rex, right? This is not our world anymore in these visuals. We get more of this in some of the other movies too. These movies and the many, many other speculative fiction movies featuring dinosaurs indicate that de-extinction is something that both fascinates and frightens viewers. The well-known speech from Jurassic Park by Dr. Ian Malcolm, Jeff Goldblum's character, says, "If there's one thing the history of evolution has taught us, it's that life will not be contained. Life breaks free, it expands to new territories and crashes through barriers, painfully, maybe even dangerously. As he says, life finds a way." But this prospect is double-edged, and these films highlight a significant ambivalence about the possibility of bringing life back. Another set of movies that fit into here would be things that address nuclear monsters. So I've got them and Godzilla here from 1954. It's clearly on people's minds in the 50s as a result of not long after World War II and nuclear testing ongoing. Them, if you're not familiar, is basically about giant irradiated ants in the Southwest desert. right? So near nuclear testing there, and Godzilla, everyone knows, I assume, but is following closely on the heels of World War II, obviously, and dropping the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And also happens not long after, if I remember right, the kind of US occupation ended and censorship ended, and so people are talking about these sorts of things more. And as H-bomb testing is happening in the Pacific Islands, so there's all of this kind of context that shapes this and that informs this movie and the ways that we respond to it as a monster movie, but also a monster movie that is the result of things we have done, right? And that have long-lasting environmental effects. I have -1 up here too because it's a great movie, not because I have anything special to say about it. And so these movies indicate that nature can be negatively impacted by our actions. The monsters here are animals and animal-like, so they have a lot in common with some of the examples from the previous section, but here we are directly responsible for their creation. They're not just like wandering into the world and doing things randomly, they are responding to our nuclear testing or our genetic engineering. We also see lots of movies about pollution. So I've got 2 examples here that I really want to talk about. One is The Host, directed by Bong Joon-ho, South Korean movie from 2006. And this is a movie about the pollution of the Han River. And it reflects actual issues of pollution of this river at the time and sets it up as the direct result of US military scientists doing something weird and like dumping stuff down the drains that they shouldn't be. And it creates this great monster that's really cool design, but it is a monster. And it kidnaps a little girl, and the whole thing is about trying to get the girl back. But in the end, we're also encouraged to feel sympathy for this monster. It is, again, the direct result of our actions. And at the end, spoilers, but at the end, when the monster is defeated, because it is that kind of movie, it is not triumphant. Similar to the end of Godzilla, the first movie, it's not triumphant, it is sad. And the music tells us this, and the cinematography tells us this, so that we are encouraged to care about the human characters, but also to care about this monster, and that complicates our relationship to these environmental issues that the monster kind of stands in for. Frogs from 1972 is one of my favorite movies. Not a great one, but I love it. And in part because it is doing something really similar. It's a movie about humans as monstrous, or at least some humans as monstrous, and about nature fighting back. The posters really highlight this. The language here is all very animal horror, nature's revenge, right? So slimy horror devouring all in its path. Today the pond, tomorrow the world, right? That's what the posters are telling us. But in the movie, we get a slightly different story. I found this description of the film's premise, and I didn't write down if it came from IMDb or the movie box or whatever, but it says, when a millionaire who kills any animal that moves on his island estate refuses to mend his ways, the swamp critters mete out some amphibian justice. So the whole movie is about this millionaire jerk and his rich family getting taken out by one animal after another. The animals are largely ignored by the people until it's too late and they're being attacked. And we're talking about like frogs, like little frogs. And there's, I think, a snake scene and a spider scene and stuff like that. But it's fairly like, these are just like real animals they filmed and then cut together with the person like falling over and being like, ah. So it's not like big monsters or anything. And the movie ends with a scene in which all the other characters, except for the millionaire patriarch, have left, right? There's a couple of good guys, they've gotten out, or they've been killed. And it's just him and the frogs. And the frogs hop into his house and hop all over him, and he dies, right? It's unclear how that killed him. He dies. And the last scene that we get in the movie proper, before like the credits and everything, is like the outside shot of the house at night with the frogs croaking. This kind of horror movie usually ends with the monsters being destroyed and maybe sunrise or some hope for the new day. And this ends with the kind of triumph of the frogs, which is, I think, really excellent. It is their justice. And I think this is an interesting instance of this sort of movie where we get to see that sort of revenge that works and doesn't get shut down at the end. Notably, this is coming out around the same time as a lot of environmental policy is changing in the early 1970s, right? So I wrote down just a few things. So like in 1970, we get, some of this is policy, some of it is social, but the first Earth Day, Natural Resources Defense Council created, Clean Air Act was passed, Environmental Protection Agency was founded. 1972, we get the Federal Water Pollution Act, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, and just after this, in 1973, we get the Endangered Species Act. And I'm not going to make an argument that frogs like made anything happen here, but it's reflecting this kind of cultural shift, right? And possibly it and the movies like it are amplifying these sorts of things. Like I think there's a kind of back and forth between the films and the policy that might be happening. Around the same time, we get several other environmental science fiction movies that are feeding into this as well. So we have Silent Running, in which all the plants on Earth are dead and they're stored in space. Soylent Green, which is about overpopulation, limited resources, the greenhouse effect. Day of the Animals, which is about ozone depletion. And in Silent Running and Soylent Green in particular, we get these really beautiful visions of Earth as it was in their past, right? The kind of beauty of Earth for us now, their past, to tell us what we're gonna miss, like what we're losing out on, right? So we get this kind of future nostalgia for nature. And this reflects this fear for nature, for what we're harming and what we're gonna lose. Jumping ahead to the 21st century, we get a lot more movies in this vein. Recently too, I think as climate change becomes a bigger part of the popular conversation, it starts to feed into other films. WALL-E, for instance, about kind of the trashification of the planet, right, the giant trash piles. Snowpiercer, which sees this future ice age that is the result, not directly of climate change, but of a failed geoengineering project to address climate change. And Mad Max Fury Road, which gets a lot of stuff in there. We've got water scarcity and pollution and environmental health, climate change, all kinds of stuff. And so these films reflecting fear for nature offer more avenues for addressing environmental issues and help shape the environmental conversation without reinforcing an ecophobic response to the natural world. At this point though, since Mad Max Fury Road is up here, this is a great example of another thing that we ought to think about when we think about environmental film, and that's the real world impact of making the movies themselves. Right? So movie making takes a lot of resources. Think about the energy to run the gear, right? To transport people, to produce the film itself, whether it's on film or digital, to build sets and whatever resources you need to actually make things work. So there's a book, I just blanked on the name of it, but there's a whole chapter about how much water Singing in the Rain took to make. It's not in my set of films for today, but it's a great example of this because it's filmed in California. It's a very dry state, and it has these great Singing in the Rain sets and buckets and buckets of water. And that's not just that movie. All films do this. Mad Max Fury Road is an excellent example of this. It's a movie that is about environmental degradation and these environmental concerns. But in filming, it got a lot of attention for basically destroying parts of a protected desert. Let me see if I wrote down where this was exactly. It was in the Namib Desert. There was a protected area they had never been driven on before, and they just drove on it, right? And then they went to clean up afterwards, and they like tractor pulled over it and pulled up a bunch of plants. Yeah, so it's a movie that's trying to say something that is intending, I think, to be entertaining but also helpful, and is causing harm at the same time. And it's not alone in this. I'm picking on that one because it's a really vivid example of this. And this illustrates a need for a change in the way that we talk about these things. Like I'm mostly that today, but it's hard to leave it out entirely. One ecomedia scholar, Sean Cubitt, writes that ecological communications become much more than alerting the human public to environmental issues, indicating that providing this information is not enough. I have to think about the materiality of what we're doing. All right, up to this point, and I'm almost done, we've seen two major threads, fear of nature and fear for nature. There is one more major thread from that opening definition of eco-horror, and it raises questions about what we even mean when we use these terms, nature and human, and how they relate to each other. Oh, sorry, this was actually the desert. I forgot I had that one in there. So fear of confusion is where we're ending here. So one way to think about this is to look at movies about parasites. So David Cronenberg's Shivers, also known as They Came From Within, and The Bay, a 2012 movie, I forgot the director, all address this. They're stories about parasites, like invading the human. And similar to the fungus movies from earlier, the fear here is largely about that crossing of boundaries and loss of control. So we like to think of ourselves like, I am me, I am an individual, I am bounded here, nothing gets in me, right? That would be weird. But there's already all kinds of things in us, right? Bacteria and things like that. And the idea that we are not shaped by or controlled by those things is just wrong, right? So these movies turn to that kind of fear and amplify it. And like so many of the other things I've said, they're really about that fear of loss of control. We also see movies about hybrids and transformations. The Fly, another David Cronenberg movie, this is clearly one of his obsessions, is an excellent example of this, where we see our central character, Seth Brundle, played by Jeff Goldblum, trying to create this teleportation machine, and he tries to transport himself, and there's a fly in there with him, so he becomes Brundlefly, right? So we have our nice trajectory there. Uh-oh. And we see the way that this change in him reflects a loss of humanity, right? And what matters to him. And by the end of the movie, when his life ends and he's just the Fly, basically, we've seen how this shift between human, non-human, this boundary crossing, becomes something only horrific, right? It's awful. All right, okay. And then one more set of movies here to end with. These are more recent movies having to do with hybrids and transformations that I think are doing something slightly different than The Fly, where The Fly is pretty much just horrific, right? It would be awful if you were part fly and part human, and end of story. These represent human, non-human hybrids that are sometimes scary, sometimes a little unnerving, but also sometimes appealing. Blood Glacier from 2013 has a lot of stuff going on, but it ends with this kind of mutant baby that's part dog and part human and maybe part something else, and it's going with the humans into the future. And we don't know what happens next. Is it scary? Are we taking this mutation out into the world and this is a threat? Is this a possibility? They kind of adopt it and treat it like a little baby that they're going to take care of. Lamb takes a more fantastic approach, but also has a hybrid human-animal child in it that is cared for and loved. And Hatching has another hybrid animal-human child in it that is grosser than in the second one, but also cared for. It protects one of the human characters and she protects it back. All of these movies, I think crucially, have children in these roles, and that makes them maybe a little less scary, a little more innocent, but also reflect, along with that innocence, a sense of what is the future going to be like? The child is often used as a stand-in for the future, right? So here we've got these human-animal hybrid children that raise the question of, like, what will the future look like? Like, could it be something other than just human? Can we work together with these kinds of creatures? These reflect a different set of fears than fears of nature kind of attacking us or fears of us harming it. They're more about boundary crossing. And they illustrate Stacy Alimo's concept of transcorporeality. This is much more theoretical than the other things I've gotten into. But briefly, she writes about this as the literal contact zone between human corporeality, like our bodies, and more than human nature, in which the human is always intermeshed with the more than human world. That's like the simplest part of this, and it's really about the way that we're not ever truly separate from the natural world. We're always physically connected to it and meaningfully connected to it. So what do we do with that? The connections between us and the more than human world, the non-human world, can sometimes be frightening. Right? We see that in some of these films, and those fears can be well-founded. But they can also provide opportunities. And the more recent movies allow for possibilities of connection, that might be frightening, mutant babies, but that also might be hopeful or positive, right? Cute mutant babies, right? So to conclude, I mean, I've given you just a really quick tour of a lot of things here, and kind of an overview of some of the big ideas that show the fears that these movies rely on and reflect. And as I hope is clear at this point, this is not just escapism. I think that's where people start when thinking about these things. I wanted to end with a Stephen King quote. He writes that we make up horrors to help us cope with the real ones, but I'm going to end by arguing with him. So I think he's not wrong about everything, right? There's truth here. Sometimes we just want a horror movie or a science fiction movie to entertain us and let us blow off some steam, right? But first, the horrors represented in these films are not always made up, right? Sometimes they're real, like they're things we should be scared of, or they're real animals that maybe we shouldn't be scared of. Second, these horrors don't necessarily help us cope with the real ones. I think that's the wrong word. They might exacerbate existing problems, thinking about Jaws, and ecophobic representations of nature. Or they might be part of a larger process that prompts us to act. So thinking about the connections between policy and environmental texts in the 1970s. But neither of these things count as coping, I don't think. And finally, at least some science fiction and horror addressing environmental issues might provide new ways of imagining futures. These imagined futures aren't utopian, and they might still be kind of scary, but they don't need to be only horrifying. If we can sympathize with monsters and find mutant babies cute, then maybe environmental horror and science fiction can also provide models for not only surviving, but living into the future that's shaped by climate change and other environmental issues. Thank you. Anyone have any questions? Bryce.
So coming into this talk, for whatever reason, it had to be alien, great, but as an example that you started with, and I'm wondering how that would figure into this conversation, because unlike most examples you provide, that seems more divorced from life touchstones, right? I'm going to be on a freighter in space, and there's the parasite bit in there. But I wonder how a movie like that seems to be set in a much more unfamiliar situation would kind of matches to this.
Yeah, that's a good question. Even though I mentioned it at the beginning, I didn't actually think it through as part of the other sections, but I think you're right, like it fits with the parasites to some degree. And that kind of boundary breaching between the human and non-human. Although I think in Alien, my sense of the kind of parasite, the chest burster and that sort of thing is very much about maintaining a sense of separation between the human and non-human. Where I think a lot of the other parasite stories I'm looking at break that down more and show the parasite having more impact on the person's life, influence over what they do. But I don't know, I have to think about that more. Other questions? Yes, Ashley.
So I was thinking about Jaws and the birds and movies today. I feel like a lot of it is gearing more towards technology, so thinking of Megan. And even Ready Player One, where it ties into some of these environmental factors, but there's going to be more fear on just the future of technology. Just wondering how that would fit into all of this, and if there's even a terminology for that, a fear of technology.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like my gut reaction is technophobia has got to be a word, right? but yeah, that's an interesting question because I hadn't thought about things like Megan as quite fitting into this. But I think you're right that there are a lot of those movies where we are like seeing a lot of concern about technology in various forms and what AI might look like in the future and things like that. Thinking about it from environmental terms, one way that I think it'd be interesting to see that play out is to have some movie find a cool way to pay attention to all the energy that goes into those productions. but that seems not super filmable. I don't know. I'm not sure how to answer that. Mary?
So I'm terrible and don't ever watch movies. So my questions are all related back to books.
Okay.
But when you were talking about, I think it was as you were talking about pollution and sympathy and movie posts, you were talking about sympathy for the monster. And I can't help but think about the book Born. And I assume you've read Born. It's by Jeff Vandermeer. And it just seems like a perfect encapsulation of having sympathy for the monster. And then you also kind of in your talk of hybrids and transformations, especially like that blur the boundary between the human and the more than human. I can't help but thinking about Never Let Me Go. And it's like a very bizarre kind of rendering of this because in Never Let Me Go, it's about like a group of people who are clones, and they're clones of individuals who at some point will need organ transplants. So they're raised as people, and then at some point like, their organs will be transplanted into rich people who can afford to have them. And so it's different than thinking about monsters, but on some level they're treated like they're monstrous individuals. So I'm just sort of curious, like, to ping that back to you on the topic of those things.
Yeah, so on Born, I don't remember any of the details, but Jeff Vandermeer is great for all of these kinds of things. Like he's really, like if the rest of you have not read any of Jeff Vandermeer's books, you should go read them. They're really interesting ways of thinking about, hybridity and transformation come up a lot, and kind of what we do with things that are weird is really more his area. And yeah, it's been a while since I've read Never Let Me Go, but what I was thinking about as you were kind of walking through the key plot points there was not so much that they were treated as monsters, but that they were treated as animals, right? And those are different, right? I was thinking more about like Val Plumwood and that sense that, you know, humans should be special and outside of this kind of dynamic. And this seems like it's applying that same logic. Like what makes us kind of horrified by that is the same logic, but in terms of other uses, like medical uses of the body instead of food uses of the body. I don't know if that makes sense. I'm kind of thinking it through as I talk.
That's a great way of thinking about it. And you're right, like they're dehumanized effectively, but they are still human and expected to live human lives, but they're living human lives in this very contained way, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's a great way of thinking about it. And reflecting it especially back to alcohol.
Erica, did you have something?
Yeah, I had a question about kind of like what do you do with the campy or parodic that comes up with a lot of these very popular films? Because sometimes you get, you know, I'm thinking about how realism, and by that I mean not necessarily that it's entirely realistic, but that you kind of are supposed to take it seriously as a possible potential, like you do with like speculative fiction or sci-fi. But then what happens when you have like this intentionally campy, comedic, or satirical or parodic like mode for a lot of these things? And how does that affect the sympathy for the message and the seriousness of the message
Right.
that's in there in that mix?
Right. I'm really glad you asked that, and I'm going to hope this makes sense, because this is something I've written some about. It's been a while. So one way of thinking about campiness and camp, right? Creature features is a lot of these things that I talked about would count as creature features, and that's kind of a subset of all of this, where we're looking at something where it doesn't necessarily need to be realistic, right? So Jaws is kind of on the edge of this, right? Something like Frogs is a creature feature. It's campy, it's a little ridiculous, right? But it's that one in particular is trying to say something. So one way to answer that is to think about who watches this and what are they getting out of it. For some audiences, there is a pleasure to be found in kind of being in on the joke and laughing at something that otherwise you have to take really seriously. And that's where I think Stephen King's quote, even though I would use different language, is headed in that direction, right? We invent these things to help us cope with reality. We tell ridiculous stories about things we're scared about because it helps us release something, right? So in some films, I think that's what's working. Another way to think about this is that some of these also could be described as exploitation films, where you have something where it's kind of maybe extra violence or extra gore or extra sex or something like that, and you draw the people in with the appeal of whatever the kind of thing like that is that you think they're going to want to see, and then you hit them with a message, right? Roger Corman, who produced so many of these movies, has said that he thinks a successful exploitation film has to have a message. And so there's this kind of pairing that's really common in a lot of these films, that you've got both of those things at once. And you've got the audience who's there for the, I don't know, sex and violence and willing to put up with a message, and maybe they'll take something away from it. And some people like me who are like, what do you have to say about environmentalism? I'll put up with the other stuff too, right? So there's an interesting thing there with that audience where it's trying to, I think, broaden the audience for this message in some ways, but also it, on the flip side, gives at least a tiny sliver of respectability, right? So, I mean, we do have something important to say in this ridiculous movie where we blew up the world or whatever. So I think there's a few ways to think about that, and it can undercut seriousness, sometimes intentionally and sometimes unintentionally. Like if we think about, sorry, one more example, The Day After Tomorrow, which I don't think was trying to be campy, but kind of is. That's a case where I think it's trying to be serious, and so the campiness undercuts the message. Whereas sometimes they're created to be campy, and then you get a bonus message, and so the dynamic is a little different. Other questions? Yes?
So I'm an ecosystem restoration specialist in Black Hills, and so a lot of things what I've seen is folks fear what they don't know. And so essentially what movies are is a recreation of things that we just don't understand.
Sure.
So we let our imagination take place of what is. And so sometimes communicating a message of what is the truth is misconstrued of what is functionally entertaining. And so
misconstrued, what is entertainment, and what is real. What can frogs do? And so I like your pedestal. I like your presentation. Me personally, I love walking. It's not love walking. I do believe that we are in a position that we're quite quickly becoming garbage disposal units for all of our existing use of everything. But that coincides with, I guess, the question is, how do you see something like, I don't know how you're using the movies to kind of show out the environmental conflicts with the human. How do you see us going forward and actually trying to use the entertainment industry as a way to share with others what the truth is and how very much we cannot coexist perfectly? And that we have to draw a line where we go into, where we don't.
Yeah, that's a tricky thing. Thinking about the relationship between like what's true and what's entertainment and how it comes out. Sometimes when I teach some of these movies, students are concerned about, well, that's not true. It's misinformation. It's one thing I've heard students say, and they want to see the movies be more accurate in some ways. And so we talk about that. Well, what would that look like? Like, do we have a disclaimer at the beginning that says, actually, sharks are not like this, right? How seriously do people take that, right? Do we just not tell stories that could be misleading like that? Like, maybe, like that's one position. I'm not sure I feel great about it. Because I think there's a lot of value in imagining things differently than they actually are. My answer as a humanities professor is that we should all be doing humanities style thinking and thinking critically about what it is we're watching and how we know what's true and what's not true and what kinds of stories exist and what shapes stories can take, which is much less prescriptive an answer than that, than it seems like you were maybe looking for. But yeah, I'm not interested in being like, we shouldn't do this sort of thing. But I am interested in helping people understand how to evaluate those things. Hopefully that's a decent answer. Does that make sense? Even if you don't agree with me.
No, it's not even agreement or argument. It's just the same cases. I just brought in my little dog a little bit ago, and you can tell our human-created laws, their association with an animal, something in the natural world, it immediately yields a. They gotta be separate from us. They gotta be controlled. We have to be controlled. And you have to be controlled from how far we go with things because an animal knows what to do. we don't have the rules.
Yeah, I'm not sure. And the other thing that I think about here is that, like I was going to say, I'm not sure that movies could help with that. Is that movies can't. Like, this is what I do. I study these things with the knowledge that, like, this is part of a much bigger kind of picture. And these movies are telling stories that shape the way that we think, but not alone, right? They do it in conjunction with the experiences we have in our actual lives and with, legislation and policy and all these kinds of things as the way we're socialized. But they don't do nothing either, right? So trying to figure out what they do and what they don't do, I think is kind of tricky. I'm not sure they can help us figure out how to respond to your dog, but I do think we could tell different stories about how we can build places for us to coexist with other species in ways that are comfortable for all of us, right? And science fiction is actually really good at this in a lot of cases. Anybody else have questions, comments? Yeah.
What do you think the most productive, style is out of the categories?
What do you mean by most productive?
Like pushing people more towards thinking about the environment and climate change.
My gut reaction, haven't thought about this much, is that the ones that probably make the biggest difference are the ones that are the most direct about their argument and that are well-funded. So as much as I love frogs, it's a movie for weird movie lovers like me. Not most people haven't seen it. Something like The Day After Tomorrow everybody saw in 2004 and everybody read about, right? I'm not sure its argument works super well though, right? So I think that's the kind of combination that I'm looking at. Some of the things that I find really interesting maybe don't do a lot as a standalone movie to kind of move the needle, right? But that's why I wanted to throw like a billion movies at you, because I think this is one of those things where if I do a reading of one film, that's cool, I enjoy doing that. But that's not giving a great sense of the overall kind of conversation, because it happens kind of in waves and kind of in groups of movies that cultural shifts happen and these conversations happen. It's a lot to ask of any one movie to do something like that. Although sometimes one movie does make a big difference. Like I said, Jaws was hugely influential, but that was like, you know, Steven Spielberg, right? Jurassic Park was pretty influential. Steven Spielberg, right? So he's a good filmmaker and he had lots of money. So that's what I've got off the cuff.
Can I spin off on that?
Sure.
So one movie can't do these things in sort of isolation. One of the things that's sort of classic about horror movies in particular is that they very rarely just one of them.
Right, yeah.
There's lots and lots and lots of those. So I'm thinking, for me, a lot of things go back to, say, Godzilla. Right? If you take the horror Godzillas, the ones where he is sort of the antagonist, those actually go through a number of different kinds of eco-horror things that you've talked about. Is the plant person one. There's versions where it's the irradiated monster. There's versions where it's climate change and the damage that we're doing. That's the Shin Godzilla version. And so you could, in this one collection of movies, kind of get a really nice description of a whole range of ecological threats and sort of how we as a species have either addressed or failed to address them over the course of time. Do you have any other, like, are there other series for folks who are the opposite of Mary and I'm terrible in the other version? I watch a lot of movies, but I don't read a lot of books. So someone for you know, like a Philistine like me, is there a collection of horror movies that I can, you know, a collection of some of the sequels that might actually go and talk about some of these things in a more nuanced way than maybe just a standalone one?
Yeah, and I think that point about horror in particular, working in like sets, like it makes a lot of sense. Like there's kind of like main character like Godzilla, and there's franchises and stuff, but there's also like with the fungus horror, it just happens that these things kind of arise at the same time sometimes. There's also like, there was a year when there were 2 asteroid movies, there was a year there were 2 volcano movies, right? That just kind of happens. And that's the flip side of this. Like, so I'm not just interested in what these movies actively do, but I'm also interested in them as kind of mirrors for what we're thinking and feeling and what we're reacting to, because I think that's what those patterns are showing us too. It's not like these different directors were like, hey, let's see if we can do something by making 2 mushroom movies in the same year. Like, no, there's just something going on like where this kind of rose up into the cultural consciousness at the same time. Yeah. Any other comments, questions? I think we might be out of time. Okay. Just like, okay, anybody else?
What's your favorite movie?
I told you not to ask me that. I don't have a favorite movie. It's like choosing a favorite child. I don't have a least favorite movie either. Anybody else? All right, thank you guys for coming.
Squeal while I was, okay. Okay, thank you for coming tonight. We do this every 3rd Tuesday. So next month, it'll be May 21st, and it will be presented by Dr. Travis Kowalski, sitting in our audience tonight. I saw this come through on the campus email, and I had to make it into a STEAM Cafe because it's just so strange. So in 1825 and 1830, students at Yale University protested changes in their math curriculum by refusing to take their geometry exams. This resulted in 43 students being expelled. So in the aftermath, the students at Yale started an annual tradition of a clandestine midnight funeral for their mathematics education, which culminated in the burning and burial of their geometry textbook. And this lasted 70 years until it just stopped, very randomly. And I thought it was so strange and interesting that it had to be a STEAM Cafe. So May 21st, Dr. Travis Kowalski, hope to see you there.